I'm Quincy Newell, and you're listening to Gospel Tangents.
Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. Being a slave, especially a woman, in 19th century America was clearly a very difficult thing, and it turns out that some of the sexual politics around that were even more fraught than I ever imagined. In our next conversation with Dr. Quincy Newell, we'll talk about these stark and horrible choices that early black women had to face. Many of them were raped. Some of them chose to get pregnant through other means as a means of protection. How does that even work? In our next conversation, Dr. Newell will talk about these very complicated and difficult choices these women had to make, and possibly Jane had to make as well. Check out our conversation. But before you do that, I just want to mention I'm giving away a copy of Dr. Newell's book on the life of Jane Manning James. If you'd like a free copy, please sign up for my newsletter at gospeltangents.com/newsletter, and I will send you this copy to the winner of our drawing that we'll have in part 5. We're in part 2 right now, but we'll do that in part 5. So sign up today at gospeltangents.com/newsletter, and you can get a copy of this book. Now back to our conversation. Now, I know in my conversation with Margaret, she said that she thought there was pretty good evidence that Jane might have been raped.
It's entirely possible. Jane is adamantly silent. She just steadfastly refuses to talk about who Sylvester's father was. And I think there's good reason to interpret that as shame and possibly as the result of sexual violence. That was probably the hardest section of the book to write, to think about sort of how do we make sense of this lack of evidence. Can we treat that lack of evidence as evidence in itself? And then what do we make of it? Because on the one hand, we want to think about sort of where did Sylvester come from? Who was his father? What were the circumstances of his conception? Black women were subject to sexual violence by white men on a fairly regular basis in the antebellum United States. That's a known fact. On the other hand, I don't want to simply assume that because Jane was black, she was raped. It's really easy for us to sort of take a black woman and just assume that her life circumstances fall into line with the statistics that we know about, and sort of the worst statistics that we know about in terms of the lives of black women during that time period. So in that sense, I'm reluctant to say for sure. I think our best bet is, yeah, she was probably raped.
Was it a minister?
I don't think so. Well, I don't think that we have enough evidence to say, is really the answer there. The theory that it was a minister comes from a comment that Jane's brother, Isaac, made to Elizabeth Roundy sometime between 1902 and 1908. Elizabeth Roundy is the person to whom Jane dictated her autobiography, and she was asked by a church leader to sort of inquire after the circumstances of Sylvester's parentage because somebody was wondering. And so Elizabeth Roundy doesn't actually ask Jane, as far as I can tell. Instead, she goes and talks to Jane's brother. And I think that's because Jane just sort of shut that line of inquiry down. And Jane's brother says it was a white minister, but he couldn't remember if it was Methodist or Presbyterian. And so this is the brother of a woman who might have been raped, talking about the circumstances of that 60 years after the fact. So the fact that Sylvester's conception is still a topic of discussion at that point is really striking to me. Because it suggests a certain kind of obsession with black women's sexuality, which I think is really interesting and worth noticing. But also, I don't trust Isaac to know what's going on 60 years after the fact. Given Jane's silence about Sylvester's conception, I'm not sure that she ever would have told her brother. There are other theories that run around in the family. One of Sylvester's granddaughters remembers that he was the child of a French-Canadian man who she believed was white. So, I mean, French-Canadian, white minister, I mean, he could have been almost anything, really. So in that sense, I mean, the circumstances are so fraught. The idea of sexual violence is such a heavy idea, and we're so quick to assume that I think we really need to interrogate that assumption at the same time that we try to piece together what evidence we have. And then, you know, I'm most comfortable leaving it as an open question, saying, you know, I think probably my best bet is that she was raped, but I wouldn't lay money on it.
Well, because I believe in your book you said something that this might have been a sign of independence as well. Or am I misremembering that?
I'm not sure what you're referring to.
Well, as far as whether she might not have been raped and that maybe she went into this willingly.
Yes. Well, so, I mean, I think there are good reasons that Jane might have had to choose a sexual union with a man, but still maybe not want to talk about it all that much. I use the comparison with a woman named Harriet Jacobs, who wrote a book called Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. She was enslaved in North Carolina, I believe, and she believed that her master was intending to rape her eventually. And so as a way to sort of defend herself against that, she actually deliberately took another white man as a lover and eventually had 2 children with him. And so there's a kind of strategic move there, a sort of use of limited options in order to avoid what seems like the worst option. And it's possible that Jane felt similarly threatened and used a similar kind of strategy.
Well, because that's interesting. I believe there was a genealogy show, Emmett Smith, Dallas Cowboys, had done some genetic DNA or something, and had found out some of his ancestors had been impregnated by a white slave master. And he was, of course, livid, which I would be too if I were him. But I know that there was a case, especially in the South, among the Southern slaveholders, that they would purposely impregnate black women so that they could have more slaves. Mm-hmm. Would that have applied in Jane's case? Because she was free, so it seems like that wouldn't have really mattered.
Right.
And I believe also in the North they had some laws prohibiting interracial marriage for that very reason.
Well, so did the South.
Okay, but it didn't matter.
Right.
If you were a slaveholder, you did what you wanted more slaves, so...
Right. I mean, so for Southern slaveholders, the questions are somewhat different than they are for Northern men interacting with free black women, mm-hmm. right? That doesn't mean that black women, in both cases, are seen as legitimate targets of sexual violence. That violence is rarely punished by the surrounding society in the North or in the South. And so in that sense, I mean, I think Jane may have had strategic reasons to create a relationship with a man who had maybe more power or more status in her local society that she would have seen as protective. But she might not have entered that relationship with any intention of ever getting married or maintaining any kind of loving, sustained relationship.
So this could have been a form of protection to fight off her master, or I shouldn't say master, but
an employer or some other predator around. I mean, I think she has to see, at some level, she has to see every male around her as a potential predator, right? But any male could also possibly be a potential ally, right? So I don't want to make her seem like just a victim, but I think women in general have to be really aware of their surroundings and of the people around them who may do them harm. And that hasn't changed. So in that sense, I think Jane may have simply been looking out for her best interests.
I mean, to me, that's kind of mind-boggling to go through all these machinations. It's so foreign to me. It's really hard to imagine. So, very, very interesting. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Dr. Quincy Newell. In our next conversation, we'll talk about Jane's request to be sealed to the prophet Joseph Smith. I was a little bit surprised how common that was.
By the 1880s, lots of people are doing it. And lots of white people are petitioning to be adopted as Joseph Smith's children. They never laid eyes on Joseph Smith. He was dead long before they became converts to the church. And their requests are being granted right and left. Like this, I think probably thousands of people were adopted. He's got a huge family. So Jane is basically asking for what lots of other people are getting as sort of a matter of course.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
It's just a widespread thing by
It's a very widespread thing. And so she's just asking for something that everybody else is getting. But church leaders find this a really difficult request to grant in her case. Because they have a lot of trouble imagining giving Joseph Smith a black daughter in eternity.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please support Gospel Tangents and become a subscriber. For just $5 a month, go to patreon.com/gospeltangents and you can hear the entire interview. And you can also get transcripts available at either our Amazon website, or if you want to give the money to me and not Amazon, please subscribe on my website at gospeltangents.com and you can click the yellow subscribe button. Of course, we're also on Facebook, Twitter, and all the other places. Make sure you subscribe on iTunes at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents. And don't forget to click here to subscribe on YouTube, here for a transcript. And over here, we've got some more of our great videos. Thanks again for listening.